In this movie, what we want to do is take a look at how we can work with some of the box model properties. Additionally, we want to review exactly how these properties impact other objects within the document. So I'd like to start off by creating a new HTML document, and you can do that by clicking the HTML button under the Create New section here on the Welcome screen. Once you create the new HTML document, you should save it. So go to the File menu, and from there you can choose Save As. Save this in the Dope Trope local site folder. We're going to go ahead and save this as box model. And once you save the document, you can go ahead and title it. You can title it something like Working with the Box Model. And once you have this document titled, we're ready to start adding some content that we can apply some of these properties to. So to start this off, we're just going to insert a generic container. We're going to come up to the Insert menu, and from there we can choose Structure, and then we can select Div. Again, we can select Div because we're not creating a real HTML document here. We're not creating a true structure. We just need some content here so we can explore some of these properties. Now this opens up the Insert Div dialog box. We're going to give this an ID of container. Now remember, you can click New CSS Rule, but this is going to take you down a path that's closer to the workflow of older versions of Dreamweaver. It's my personal belief that this button will be removed from future releases of Dreamweaver CC. So I'm not going to take you down that path. We're going to go ahead and click OK. Once you click OK, we have the div element with some placeholder text. We want to go ahead and use the CSS designer to create a rule to control this element. So I'm going to go ahead and double click the Files panel to collapse it. For sources, we're going to go ahead and click the plus sign, and we're just going to define these CSS rules within the page. Now we're going to come down to selectors, we're going to click the plus sign, and we're going to go ahead and type in #container, and it should automatically pick that up for you, and it should appear in a menu which you can select. Once you press Enter or Return, you then have the properties available to you. In this case, what we want to do is just add a background color. So you can come over to the background category. And for the background color, you can open up the swatch. I'm going to go ahead and choose one of these gray colors. I'm going to go with #333333, which is a very dark gray color. That's all we want to do for right now. You'll notice that we do have some placeholder text. The placeholder text is fine, but I want to make sure that this placeholder text is within a paragraph element. This is going to give us the ability to really see how the box model properties work. So let's come into the split view. Within the split view, we can add a paragraph element around that placeholder text. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up a P element. Then I want to make sure to close it after the text goes here. So if I expand this a little bit so it's easier to read, you should see a div element with an ID of container, then a paragraph element. Okay, perfect. Now what we want to do is add a rule to that paragraph element so we can control it. Now we're going to create a descendant selector, so we can come over to the selector section of the CSS designer and click the plus sign. Right now you'll notice it reads computed. That's taking the overall values of all properties across all selectors that are applied to the particular selection. In order for us to be able to add a selector, we need to deselect computed, and we want to make sure that our source is set to the style, which means we're writing this selector inside the document. Then we'll have the ability to click the plus sign here in the selector section. And like I said, I want to create a descendant selector, so we want to target the paragraph element, but only when it's found within a container element. And a container element means an element that has the container ID associated with it. So go ahead and press Enter or Return to accept that new selector. And in this case, what we want to do is set up a background color so we can see the difference between the div element and the paragraph element. Let's come over to the background properties. And in this case, we're going to set a background color. And the background color will be a lighter gray. Let's go with something like 999999. And once you do that, you'll notice that it looks like the div now contains that color, but it doesn't. We have the paragraph element inside the div, and because the paragraph element doesn't have a width or height attribute associated with it, it's essentially going to fill up the parent container, which is exactly what we're seeing here. So if we want to be able to see the differences between the div element and this paragraph element, we can apply some other properties to it. So let's come back to layout, and in the layout section, what we want to do is set a pixel value for the width and the height. And I'm going to go ahead and set this to 325 for the width. Now you can see the paragraph element inside the div element. We also want to assign a height of 325 pixels. And when you do that, you'll notice that the div element automatically expands to accommodate this paragraph element. And that's just how HTML works. A parent container will expand to accommodate its children if necessary. So now that we have this set up, what we want to do is take a look at what happens if the parent container has a width value assigned to it. So come over to the container selector, and in this case, we're going to go ahead and set its width to 325 pixels. Once you type that in, you'll notice what you're seeing here is some margin on the top and the bottom. These are essentially vertical margins. Now, if we were to look at this in live view by clicking the live button, remember Dreamweaver has the WebKit rendering engine built inside of it. Inside of live view, you don't see the vertical margin on the top and the bottom. This is something called vertical margin collapse, and this is very important to understand. Vertical margin collapse will happen because you don't want two vertical margins to be stacked on top of one another. A very basic example would be a paragraph of text. If you had a vertical margin of 10 pixels, if you think about the line of text, if your vertical margin is 10 pixels on the top and the bottom, well, then you'd end up with double spacing because the first line would have 10 pixels underneath it. The second line would have 10 pixels above it, giving you 20 pixels. And typically, that's not your intention. Your intention is to have 10 pixels of margin. So therefore, the largest value will rule, and the smaller vertical margin will collapse. Now, what we're seeing here is something a little bit different. We have a nested element, and if a nested element's margin touches the edge of its container without any padding or border, the margin will collapse. So this is going to add to the confusion. It's going to add to complicating how you're going to lay out your content, but it's something that you definitely need to understand. So what we're going to do is exit out of live view, and then we're going to come back to the container rule. And inside of the container rule, we're going to go ahead and add 20 pixels of padding on all four sides. So here, inside the CSS designer, make sure you have the container selector selected. Then in the properties section under the layout category, you'll see padding. Click this little button here in the center, so when you change one property, you change all of them. And you want to go ahead and update this to 20 pixels. Now, when you type in 20 pixels, you will see 20 pixels on the left and on the right. But then what you're seeing is essentially something a little bit taller on the top and on the bottom. We're seeing 20 pixels of padding on the bottom and the top, but there's a default value of 16 pixels or something close to that for vertical margin. So what we're really seeing here is 36 pixels of space between the content and the edge. And if we go into live view, it's going to look exactly the same because we're not getting vertical margin collapse anymore because this nested element's margin isn't touching its parent's edge. So we're not getting vertical margin collapse anymore. So what we're truly seeing here is 36 pixels, the 20 pixels of padding, and then the 16 pixels of vertical margin. Now, we don't have content stacked on top of one another, so we're not seeing vertical margin collapse anymore. But as we add more elements to the page, if we did in fact have two elements touching and they both had vertical margin, you would see that vertical margin collapse. So as you can see, we're just scratching the surface here of understanding how the box model works. We're going to continue this discussion in the next movie.